attending Startup Boston, year number 6. This is the second day. Right now, you're tuned in for the Price is Right, understanding your revenue and pricing model. If you are looking to join the event over at WPI, which is building a scalable people ops operation as a team of one to start, just go up to your top left area at the agenda tab. You can switch over to that session if you'd like. If you are virtual, if you are here, it's a bit of a walk, so I think you're stuck with us here. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to a good friend of mine, Nisarg Javeri, who's going to be moderating our next panel. So, Nisarg, how are you?
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Hi, I'm Nisarg. I'm a recent graduate from UMass Lowell, and I just graduated with finance and accounting degree. And I'll be starting out with EY's assurance team, but I have always been interested in switching over to the venture capital side of things and just been more curious about the startup network. So thank you so much, Brandon, for having me here. And I'll let off Pam to introduce herself. Yes, please. Pam, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Could you please introduce yourself?
When I unmute myself, it lags for a second. So hi, I'm Pam Kaur. I am the head of bank technology at Bank Tech Ventures. There I work with startups, kind of pretty much doing anything that they need to help them better suited for our limited partner base, which are community banks.
Thank you. Nathan, could you introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Baumeister, CEO and co-founder of Z Suite Tech. Been working in the startup scene in fintech for quite a while now, and excited to be talking with you and having a discussion about pricing.
Thank you. And Karan, can you please introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Karan Kashyap. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup called Posh. And excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, all three of you. All right. So first to start off, I would love to have any and all questions come in. So please ask away whenever you want. And we can get started. So let me ask the first very basic question is, what do you think of pricing models? What strategies did you come up with so far? And how have they been working for you? This question is directed for our CEOs. Karan or Nathan, please answer away.
Sure, I can jump in first. So so just for some background, Posh is a conversational AI company. So we develop both digital and voice-based virtual assistant technology, and we focus today on financial services. So most of our partners are banks, credit unions, and financial services companies. So what we've done is, we looked at both kind of what's the norm in the industry, so that we're not going too far away from how buyers tend to buy and what they expect to buy. But we also wanted to make sure that, as we price, we're considering both the cost of goods sold on our side, so making sure that we're not going to be exposing ourselves to any situations where we might be pricing in a way that's not aligned with our own expenses and our own costs. But we also thought about, how do we price such that it's going to be, kind of values aligned with the buyer as well, right? So in the sense that we're not necessarily coming up with a very high fixed fee if our product tend to be seasonal or volume based, for example. So we can get more into details, I guess, but one of the big things that we've thought about is essentially looking at our own costs under the hood, as well as thinking about how the customer gets value from our product and how do we align those two dimensions.
Yeah, and I don't think that I would add too much more than what was shared. I think anyone on my team would tell you that they know that pricing is my least favorite thing to do. Really, in the end, I just wish people would tell me how much they want to pay, and then we can find out whether or not that's something that I can do. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. It's kind of like walking around with a blindfold and feeling around, trying to figure out what the right price is. Because even if you go to your buyers don't know how much they're willing to pay. And even if you tried surveys and you're asking questions and those types of things, even well-structured ones, you're still not going to get the right type of input. The only way that you can get input on whether your price is right is by going through the full sales cycle, by negotiating, finding out where you're winning and where you're losing. Obviously, you need to have some sort of notional idea of where to begin as you kind of start that process of feeling around in the dark. And yeah, looking at costs is obviously a great place to go, because we all know that you can't start pricing something by losing money, unless, of course, you're using a loss leader strategy, which works in some aspects. But remember that if you are using a loss leader strategy, at some point you do actually have to make money somewhere. Or you look at value, right? So what's the value that I can create? What's the ROI that folks are going to get? And can I convince them of that ROI case, and that they should be paying a portion of that value to us, kind of in compensation for what we're allowing them. But it's definitely not a science, definitely not an art. It's kind of a combination of two, for sure, is at least what we found.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Just to follow up on that, what has Pam, what have you seen in the companies you worked with so far? What has worked for them in particular? Could you share some insight on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's pretty in line with Nathan and Karen are saying. I think it's kind of a shot in the dark at times. I think so. I've been on the other side as well as the consumer, buying these products, and I think depending on who you're talking to and what the product is and who's talking, the price can vary. So things that I've seen fintechs particularly do, especially working with banks. I'm sure this is in other industries as well, but some things that have worked are tiered pricing, depending on what kind of products that you're offering and depending on what the levels of services are, setting your pricing based that way. Another thing is asset-based pricing. So this is a little bit more specific to banking. The customer gets charged based on not their personal, but their company's assets. And another thing is transaction-based pricing. So you get charged a minimum X amount of transactions, and anything more than that is a different tiered pricing. So say, you get charged $500 for 1,000 transactions, but you're doing 2,000. So the next 500 are charged at an extra 10 cents or 20 cents or however else you want to work that out. So I think sometimes in that way, it can be a little bit more appetizing for the customer. Especially if they're a little hesitant on what the product is. Maybe it's new, very new to them, and they're not totally comfortable with the idea of working with a startup, or they're not totally comfortable with this new technology that you're offering or new services that you're offering. Kind of showing them that, hey, you're really going to pay for what you do and what you utilize. It's a little bit more tempting than just saying, hey, it's going to cost you $20,000 and that's your flat fee. And they might not know what they might actually get out of that until they've gone through the process. So I've seen asset and tiered and transaction pricing pretty popular.
That's interesting. Thank you. So just to follow up on a tangent from there is, how often should you be switching over strategies to make sure that you're getting the optimal results? So what has been working on that end? And is there a particular amount of time that you should be at least having to test out your strategies?
Well, I'll jump in first. I think we should always be willing to experiment, because you never know what you could be learning. I think, though, the experiments that you can do is going to be very dependent on your sales cycle. And so if you're more of a B2C company and your sales cycle is literally 10 minutes long, or 5 minutes, they look at a site, they decide whether to buy it or not, or they move forward, you can do a lot of fun A/B tests. If a lot of it is like online, there's a lot of really cool software you can do out there to always be testing different pricing bundles, different pricing points, all those different types of things. But if your sales cycle is like, 6 months or 12 months long, your ability to experiment it's going to be slow in the making, and it's going to take time to actually figure out, like, did I learn anything from my first strategy before I change something else, right? And so if you throw out in the universe a particular pricing strategy and you're doing like a 6-month sales cycle or a 12-month sales cycle, you have to wait to actually get feedback in the marketplace to know whether or what your learning is from that perspective. And so if you're doing that and every month you're just changing the price, then you actually have no constant or null hypothesis from which you can actually measure your experiment against. And so you do have to be pretty cognizant of that, but the willingness to be open and always changing things is definitely paramount, because the market changes. And again, I guarantee you that you're going to get your pricing wrong the first time you do it, the second time you do it, the third time you do it, and the fourth time you do it. The general idea, though, is hopefully every time you do it, you're getting closer to the optimal price of the balance between getting as much money as you can by getting as much sales as you can. And we're actually doing an experiment right now. We're trying to increase our prices, and the first bank that we were selling to, we just pitched it to them yesterday, and they started laughing at us. And so we were like, we started laughing too. We're like, yeah, we weren't really serious about that. It's good. This is our actual pricing, and we retreated really quickly back to our other pricing. But it was good feedback.
Oh, that's amazing. Excuse me. So just going off of that, how much can you attribute to what stage of your growth cycle are you in? Like if you're a seed-based, if you're at the seed level for funding, or if you're in the introduction or the growth phase of your company, does that impact your pricing models? And if so, how much should you be attributing to that part of things and be willing to experiment over there versus the later stages in your company?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think as Nathan said, like this is not the most fun thing to be working on generally. Like as a CEO of a company, of like typically more fun things you want to be doing, like building products and talking to customers and getting out there. Pricing is important because if they laugh at you, they're not going to buy from you. So you have to find a pricing that people think in their hearts that, hey, this makes sense, right? They don't feel like they're getting ripped off. They feel like it's a good value. But you also don't want to make it such a good value that you're leaving a lot of money on the table, right? So that balance is pretty important. From our experience, over time, as we've grown the company, we find that our products tend to get a bit more complicated, right? So you might have more features, you might have more bells and whistles, or more configurable components that you could be selling to a customer. So as the ability for you to like basically expand your product over time, like cross-sell, upsell is what they call it. Like you start by landing with some product, and over time you keep selling more incremental, add-ons or something like that. Early on at like a seed stage company, you typically don't have that many add-ons, right? You typically have like one main core simple product. And oftentimes it's more straightforward and simple to price when you're a simpler company because you don't have that many levers. And also you're trying to just get traction, right? So you're like probably more willing to make your product a bit more attractive from a pricing standpoint to get initial traction. But over time, things like LTV and net retention expansion basically are your customers' total value per customer increasing over time year over year. That's really important. So like, are your customers on average buying more this year than they bought last year? And one way to drive that, of course, is by upselling on existing product suites, or by adding add-ons and cross-selling across other products that you have, right? So what I found is that fortunately, as you grow your company, you probably have more people that are also working on stuff like this. So it's not just like me and Nathan staying up late at night thinking about pricing all the time. It's we typically have supporting casts of people that are probably helping us with this as well. So as your product is getting more complex, you might have particular types of roles in your company, like product marketing managers, for example, or rev ops people, sales ops people that are often thinking about things like this, which is good because it's not just you.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would add as it relates to stage is each stage, forget about the amount of money that you're raising or whether you're going to be VC backed or not. But as you think of a seed stage and a Series A stage and a Series B stage, generally there are milestones that you've hit to be able to do those things. One of the big things that you're looking for in seed stage is product market fit. And by definition, part of product market fit is understanding how much people are willing to pay for it. If you don't know how much people are willing to pay for it, then you don't have product market fit, and you probably shouldn't move to Series A, which means that Series A typically means you got product market fit. Now you're ready to scale at a small level, and then Series B is you figured out how to scale at a small level. Now let's kind of take it up to the next notch. And so when you're in Series seed, it's not about optimizing how much money can I possibly get and let me maximize that revenue. It's about learning and figuring out what the value actually is and do people want to buy and those types of things. The stakes get higher the further along you get as a company, because now you're starting to bring on a whole bunch of new clients and stuff like that. And so if your pricing is off by 50% for your first 5 clients or your first 10 clients, whatever it is, that's not a big deal. If your pricing is off by 50% for your 100th to 200th client, then that's a huge deal because that's a lot of value that you're leaving on the table. So I always like to use the analogy. I don't know if any of you are violinists out there. I personally didn't play violin. I played the bass. I played the really big one. But one of the things that I like about the violin is you have two tuners, right? So as you're playing the violin with the strings, you need to make sure that the strings are in tune with the right note that you're looking for. And you have the big tuners up top. That's when you're way out of tune. Use the big tuners. And then at the bottom, you have what are called fine tuners, which makes it just small little adjustments here or there. And so there's no doubt in the series seed moving into A, you're using all the big tuners up top. And then as you mature and you grow, you're doing much more fine tuning from that perspective as you're learning more and more about it. So the changes that you would see in your pricing typically aren't going to be nearly as dramatic the further along in the stage and maturity that you are.
Right. Thank you. So just going off of that line of thought, so before Series A, what time frame did you guys realize that, okay, you need to switch from an acquisition model to a monetization model for your products? I'm not sure if you need me to rephrase that question, but I just wanted to ask it along the lines that what made you realize that, okay, this is a time frame that now I can actually monetize on the product that I have before Series A?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always trying to monetize, right? Like as Nathan put it, like you don't have product market fit if you don't have people paying a realistic price for your product. Otherwise, if you give something away for free and a lot of people use it, that's great, but you don't really have a business until people actually pay you something that you can survive off of. So like, you're always trying to monetize and you're trying to drive, realistic value. But I think kind of what you're saying, Nisarg, is like early on, you don't really have a lot of data points either, right? Like you're kind of testing the waters, throwing darts, if you will, to some degree to figure out, hey, what's too high, what's too low, what's in the middle. You also don't have like a really solid understanding of your own costs often. Like when you're a startup, you're often doing like pretty unscalable things early on just to get off the ground. And then as you start to grow, you're building more processes, you're trying to focus on like unit economics and efficiency and things like that. So, it's difficult sometimes to like understand like what your true margins are early on because you're doing things that are naturally pretty unscalable early on. And then as you start to mature, as you start to get from like your first early adopter customers to like that early scale of, getting more customers at a pace that's not just like easy for founders to themselves manage. At that point, hopefully you're getting a better understanding of like what your true costs of goods sold are, better understanding of the client's value. Are they actually getting the value that you thought they'd be getting, more or less, et cetera? That gives you some opportunity to fine tune and refine. But one thing I think that's like really important to just acknowledge, you talk about acquisition versus like, true monetization, is that I don't know whether you're ever like Nathan said, I don't know whether you're really quite ever there, because the more you keep working on your product, the better you make things, the more improvements you make. Like you should be seeing that the value that your customers are getting is getting better over time, right? So if your value is getting better over time, technically your that spectrum of like pricing to value, like that's always dynamic. It's never really static, right? So it's always important to keep assessing that.
And the only other thing that I would add to that, because he's right on in his advice there. The thing I would add to it is no company is going to be the same. No industry is going to be the same. And so whether or not you ever take institutional money or you're bootstrapping it all or whatever, I encourage everybody to either get a good solid board together, or at least good solid board advisors who have been there, done that in your industry, because they will help you see the business from a perspective of experience, where they can help you see when you need to be making switches, when you're not doing as much as you should on one side or the other. Hey, back off on price a little bit. You need to go faster, and I can see that you're pushing the envelope a little bit. Hey, you guys are getting too aggressive. You need to slow down a little bit. Let's try and figure out how to change the pricing and figure out what's going on there. That type of advice from an outside perspective that has been there, done that, is extremely helpful. And I've found tons of value in that in all the businesses that I've worked on as a startup founder.
Sir, can I ask one question? I had a question for Pam, actually, because Pam, you were theoretically the buyer of what Nathan and Karan were kind of selling in the past. And so when you had this tug of war on pricing with different founders and companies that you might have been working with as third-party vendors, how much of I guess what was the thought process internally from like an enterprise perspective where the value of whatever the service was or the product was allowed you to say, okay, we're willing to pay a premium then. We're willing to maybe pay a little bit more than we normally would. And I mean, you worked with specifically inside of a bank, notoriously known for being conservative in nature, right? So I guess kind of talk about that internal dilemma from the enterprise customer standpoint.
Yeah, I think there's a few different facets to that. One, I think so depending on the service, if it's saving you money, of course, that's a huge win. So I think, that was honestly at a bank, the number one priority is how is this going to save us money, from my perspective as an operational person. And then second is how is it going to make us money? So, if this is going to be some product that's going to, outweigh the cost, obviously, at a certain point, it's going to be, that's the forward outlook on it. There's, what is this going to look like a year from now? What is it going to look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And those are actual financial analysis that the people are doing on the other end to make sure that what they're paying for is worth it in the end. I think an additional part of that is whether we're comfortable paying that price for what the company is. So I know that's something, banks in particular, I'm sure other companies as well struggle with when partnering with a startup is, do we trust this person? Is it worth paying this much money for? So another thing that we kind of looked at there was, what references will we have with them? Do they have customers that we can trust and talk to now already that we can, leverage and see if this is actually worth the investment that the company is making into the startup, not just investment, as a backing, but investment as we're purchasing the service from them. So I think looking at it in that lens is also super important. If you have 2 or 3 champion customers that, feel very, just great about your product, I think it's, very important to have them in your back pocket of, hey, you need a reference of whether you want to actually sign on with us, go talk to, our bank that we have a very great relationship, or our customer that we have a very great relationship. And then we kind of are still doing something like that now at Bank Tech Ventures is, we connect our limited partner banks with other banks that are using services like Nathan's to kind of make them feel a little bit better about, hey, we wouldn't typically go into this field or go into this product market, but this other customer of theirs is doing great with it. And so that makes us feel better, and that makes us feel more comfortable spending X amount because someone else has already vetted it. And so that makes us feel a little more comfortable.
All right, thank you. Actually, do we have any questions at this stage? I'm not sure if we... I'm not ready yet. Okay. Yeah. Because I think I just saw a few, so...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, continue, and I'll sift through them all.
All right. So, well, we have been through a lot of things over here. So I want to switch up gears and ask you the very basic and probably the textbook question for you, which would be, how can you simply do value-based pricing versus cost-based pricing? And this is a question that you can find in any textbook as well, but I want to get some insight from you guys specifically.
Yeah, I can jump in because we actually are in the middle of another round of reassessing our pricing actively right now. So, as we talked about it, we're never ever really done, but you have, periods over time that you come back and say, okay, are we doing it the right way? Let's reassess. Sometimes you want to, hypothetically start from scratch, whiteboard everything from the beginning to see if you end up at the same place. So cost-based pricing is really just making sure that you have healthy margins on top of the cost of goods sold, right? So if you have, if you're selling something and it costs you like $1 to make it, you should ideally be selling it at something above $1. VCs, depending on the industry you're in, like to see you're selling it at $1.30 or $2 or $3 sometimes. So, you want to be mindful of, how much you want to ideally have from a margin standpoint, depending on what industry you're in and what your peers in that industry are doing as well. So that's pretty simple. It's like a pretty good place to start from an early stage company standpoint, because you don't often really know what the value is in an early stage because you don't have many people using it. So one of the best places to start is actually cost-based pricing. Over time, though, you might start to realize that simple cost-based pricing is difficult to, really keep as the sole source of pricing, because over time, ideally, your economies of scale should result in your own cost getting marginally lower every time, right? So over time, when you get from like 1 customer to 100 customers, ideally like the 100th customer, the cost to serve the 100th customer is like a lot less for you than the cost to serve that initial first customer. So you could ideally like keep your pricing the same and you would have more margin over time. But you might also start seeing from actually having customers live that you're generating a lot more value on the 100th customer that you were at an early stage company, right? So at the time you start to scale, you're like, wow, we've been repeatedly seeing that we're just generating so much more value for the customer than what we're actually pricing them. So, if you're doing a negotiation, just, game theory wise, oftentimes 50-50 is a good place to land, right? You deliver 50% more value, you take 50% of that home. It's tricky there though. Like, that's another thing that gets tricky is like, what percentage of the savings should you be pricing for? What percentage of revenue growth should you be pricing for? That's also, there's no rule of thumb there. Sometimes if you think about like business models, like when people do referral or reseller based partnerships with people, sometimes they'll only take like 10%, 20% of the revenue that they're basically helping the other company realize. So that percentage and how you think about value-based pricing can be pretty tricky. Again, like it's nothing that's like super easy, but the gist of it is that if you're generating a lot of value for the customer, then it makes sense that even if you take a piece of that, the customer should still be happy because it's a win-win. You're giving them something that they weren't getting before. And it's sometimes value-based pricing will actually give you a lot more revenue than cost-based pricing because the value that you're giving them is way higher than the cost of actually serving them or doing any kind of cost-based model.
Yep. There were a couple of questions that came through around this idea of if a business is built on more of a service aspect and less of a product aspect, which can be a little bit tougher to quantify from a valuation standpoint. I know both Nathan and Karan have had educational or consultative services as a part of their product offering. And I know Pam has seen a lot of kind of, whether it's banking consulting services come through or has been kind of a part of that. I mean, Bank Tech Ventures is somewhat part of that as well. So how do you kind of think about that pricing model and the scalability of that aspect when it's not a physical or tangible product? I wanted to start with Pam on that one.
That is a great question. Personally, I feel like in that instance, since you're not really selling if you're not selling a product, I think when you're selling a service, you need to take into consideration the level of effort and qualifications and just industry knowledge. So if you are doing, if you're offering, consultative services, you need to take into consideration the skill set and the level of knowledge of the services that you're offering. So I think, you look at, say, for example, you're offering IT services. So look at what, the customer would typically pay for, an hourly employee to do something like that. And then I think that's a great way where that's a great, instance where you can tap into your board or your network contacts and see, what does someone typically pay for a service like this? And I think that's where it's easier to set it based off of industry standards a little bit versus when you're trying to sell a product. Your product's going to be different, but I think the services are typically pretty similar, unless you're offering some, crazy new service. I think that's where it's pretty easy to set it based off industry standard. If you are selling some service that, hasn't really been taken into consideration before, I think, like I said, basing it off of what you personally feel like your services are worth. So I think there's so many different ways to look at that. I think service is a little bit harder to price than product because it's just, there's so many different aspects that go into it. If you are selling consultative services, there's the person's education, their level, years of experience. And then I think the offset of the value that you're providing to the company. So say you're doing IT consultative services. If you're going to, improve efficiencies by X amount for this company, you can base it off of that. If you're going to save them X amount of hours per, week, base it off of that. I think there's just so many different ways to look at it versus a product because it's like a tangible thing versus a service is more, can be theoretical. It's not necessarily here's what you're getting and that's it. The service, I think there's more of the human aspect to it. So I think there's multiple ways you could look at it.
And I kind of rephrase the question a little bit for Karan and Nathan's standpoint. So when you're thinking about that educational piece, both of you have a big educational hurdle as it relates to teaching your end users on the products that you're offering. So there is a consultative service you are offering for free in tandem with the product itself. But if you're thinking about it just from a service aspect, if the educational hurdle is that difficult in an industry that is reluctant to change, does that mean a founder should not pursue it at all? Or is that actually more of a greenfield initiative where it's ripe to be broken?
So that's a good question. Um, I am personally a big fan of the business philosophy that I am mostly interested in finding a group of people who have a similar pain point, figuring out what their pain point is, and then helping them solve that pain point, and then using that to bring to fruition the services that I'm providing. There's a lot of things in this world, like the world does not like change. And so everything's going to fight to keep the status quo. A startup company disrupts status quo. And so everyone's against you. And so if everyone's against you, don't make it harder for yourself by saying, I'm going to do something that no one's ever thought of before, that no one's talking about it right now. But I think this is the way the world's going to go. And we're going to go make the world move in this direction. There are people that do that. I'll tell you, though, that there's way more people that fail at doing that than win at doing that. So instead, what I like to do is I'm just like, dude, I want to sell to this group of people. What are some things that this group of people are having difficulty with? And then I sell to that. And when I sell to that, the natural consequence of, I call it pulling the thread. The natural consequence of pulling the thread is you'll find out what products and services that you need to offer to be able to make sure that they're successful in fulfilling the objectives that they want to fulfill. Not that I want to fulfill, but that they want to fulfill. And so that then determines, okay, well, in order to help them do the thing that they need to do, I need to add this service component, or I need to add this educational component. But it's all to the service of solving the pain that they have. Because if I'm trying to solve a problem of, I believe the world needs to be in this certain way, and therefore I need to educate them on this is the way the world should be, I've already lost because it's not in service of what they're doing. Therefore, they're not going to pay for it unless I can convince them. But then you're in the game of convincing them, which is where you don't want to be. So in the end, what I look for is the way I price is going to align with the services that I need to provide, which are in line with the way that I need to naturally work with my clients to ensure that they're successful in solving the pain that they have. And a good example of this, we do a lot of our pricing is variable based. And the reason is because we want to make sure that that we don't want to be making money if our clients aren't making money. That's a bad place to be, right? And so we want to be aligned. Now with that, what that means is I depend on the success or adoption of my products at the bank. And so if I depend on their adoption, then I need to make sure that they're adopting it. Therefore, it makes sense for me to actually build some services in that happens, because that will drive my revenue. But it's a natural consequence of that logical chain. It's not something that I say, well, this is the way that we're going to do it.
I wanted to add something to that. I think from the the consumer perspective, there's lots of customers that have purchased a product and are only using just a little fraction of what the actual offering is. And I think having someone to kind of do that educational piece of it is super important. You can help them, get really the full value of your product. And I think that reduces the time of your own services you need to offer them later on when they say, hey, you promised this, but we haven't even gotten, tip of the iceberg on that. But if you can show them, this is how you actually use the product, this is, what your value you're going to get out of it, this is the best practice. You save a lot of time and effort for your own team, in the end. And also when they're, if you're trying to renew a contract, you can say, hey, look at all the things that you've done with this versus, oh, we barely use this, or, it didn't really provide the value that we thought it would. I think the educational piece is super important there. There's lots and lots and lots of instances where I personally experienced, end users in my own company saying, we purchased this, but it wasn't worth what we thought it was because, it didn't do XYZ, but it turns out it does do XYZ plus ABC also. They just didn't know how to do that, or they just didn't know that it even did that.
I guess so, Karan, I guess I know you focus on a lot of like the case study initiative aspect. And so especially within, banking. It takes, one bank to be using something for another bank to adopt it. But that educational piece, the service piece that you guys offered, if you were to offer that, just that alone, in implementing what your service is, which is that kind of the AI chatbot phone services to banking itself, that could be its own company. And so how are you able to quantify the value of just that service alone as you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good way to think about it is like, what would it cost somebody else to do that in-house, right? Like not just the actual person's time doing the service, but the time it takes to find that person who can do that service, right? So it's like you're almost like if you're doing a services-based play where really the goods is your time. It's not just the time, it's also the fact that you're there doing it, right? Like you as an individual are uniquely qualified to be doing this thing. And especially if it's a really niche skill set or a difficult to find skill set, like that itself has value, the fact that you're there, right? So we're talking about like conversational AI for banks. I think it's like kind of a niche skill set to find somebody that like knows kind of the cutting edge of like what's happening in the conversational AI space, but also understands how banks work and the systems that they have and what's feasible, what's not feasible, et cetera. So like that intersection of these like two skill sets makes this even more of a niche kind of skill set or background. So I would definitely like value that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry.
Right. Actually, I know that we are really short on time at this point, so it's 9:50.
Well, okay, you're fine. Yeah.
All right. So just want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So this is a very interesting divergence to the topic, is like, what can we do for service side of things? So for that particular part, now, what have been the best pricing models that you have seen so far for services specifically that have started out and can be a very good baseline to experiment off of? And your experiences, Pam, for you, what have you seen so far and what have you advised people to do when they're starting out?
What have I seen so far? So I think, like Arun mentioned, I've definitely seen it based off of the niche. There are very specific people that can speak to very specific things, and I think when you can base it off of this is my time and this is the effort that it takes me to do this, that has been pretty much the biggest one that I've seen. And then I don't know that I've really advised anyone on the services pricing piece of it yet, so I can't really speak to that part, but I've definitely seen, coming into me based off of time and skill set, and I think those are pretty much the biggest things that I've seen so far, and I think the team kind of mentioned on those already. There's only so many ways you can price that. That makes sense. Like Aaron said, there's only so many people that have those skill sets that you can tap into. So knowing that it's going to cost you X amount to go out and try to find those services yourself, that makes it a little bit more feasible to understand why somebody would charge the amount that they're charging.
The other kind of big conversation thread going through the chat right now is, how are you basing your pricing on some of your competitors? Is it a race to the bottom or the cheapest price? Is it, are you able to kind of offer that premium based on the cost savings or the bandwidth increase of a particular employee? So what is the factor of a competitor's pricing effect on your pricing model?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to like keep tabs of what competitors are doing, obviously. I think if you're like kind of in that race to the bottom experience, that's like not good for anybody. It's bad for both the competitors, or all the competitors, also bad for the customer, because like now you're so worried about like squeezing that little tiny piece of margin that you have left that you're not really focused on being able to invest in making the product better. I think it's important to keep tabs of competitors so you're not like ballpark off, right? You're kind of in the same vicinity to some degree, but even that doesn't necessarily matter if you can justify why you're pricing the way you are based on some differentiating factor, maybe better product quality, or just the fact that like like you just have something that you feel like the competitor is not offering today or lags behind, right? So one of those components may not even be product related, it might be relationship driven, right? Like maybe you have just built a relationship with the buyer really well, and that relationship holds a lot of value. And so even if you're priced more, they just know you a lot better than they know your competitor, and they feel like they trust you more, and they're still getting a win-win out of it. If you take everything else at par, just hypothetically say you and the competitor have exactly the same product, even then the relationship really matters, especially in B2B sales, right? So a buyer who's spending 6 figures on your product, that relationship trust really matters, right? It's not just the dollars and cents at the end of the day. It's like, do they feel like you're the right party to partner with long term, especially when you have sometimes multi-year contracts in B2B. That relationship also should not be discounted as well. So it's important to think about competitors. You don't want to be crazy far off, but if you focus on aligning your pricing with value, focusing on differentiation, and considering those soft areas like relationships and stuff like that, I think it doesn't matter a whole lot ultimately.
And Nathan, before, I don't know if you or Pam want to jump in, but I guess how are you going about even finding your competitors' pricing models, right? Not something they're going to really publicize for the most part, unless it's very transparent B2C option. But I guess, what kind of resources are you leveraging to get a better understanding of the comparables in the space?
I think that's where I would leverage my board and other advisors, have them go out and get those quotes and find that information out for us. I think typically your advisors would be people that have been in the industry and kind of know what the general pricing is. So that's where you should heavily lean on in that area for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to find out, and there's lots of different ways to do it. Just don't use your company's email address if you're filling out the lead form. They'll figure it out. I've never done that. I've heard of people doing that. When I'm selling in a space where there's obvious competitors, from a pricing perspective, I actually sigh in relief, because it helps, because there's some anchors out there and there's some value that's already been distinguished. And so at that point, it becomes a strategic decision. Where do you want to price yourself? Do you want to be the premium product? Do you want to be the low cost provider? Do I want to be middle of the road? Those types of things. The other thing it allows you to do is it allows you to survey the market and decide, hey, I actually want to change the conversation. Everyone's talking about pricing and doing things in this way. And yeah, we're in the same space, but we see this slightly different way of looking at it that redefines the marketplace, that allows us to be able to change the entire conversation. It might be basing the variable on which you have your variable pricing based off of. It could be based off of a different service. It could be based off of creating a new category. Several of you, if you haven't read Blue Ocean Strategy, that's a fabulous article that was written, Harvard Business Review. There's another book called Play Bigger that talks about this idea of creating your own category. And even in Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, talks a little bit about that as well. But if you're thinking about marketing, if you're thinking about pricing, if you're thinking about categories and those types of things, all three of those kind of have the same message of which you can look at, or you can change the conversation. And so having some anchors, having some bias from which you could actually position yourself in a different fashion ends up being pretty helpful in the scheme of things when you can do that. Because if you really are in a completely new category, a new pricing perspective, the idea of being blindfolded and walking around in the dark becomes even more real because you are the first one doing it.
So we have about 15 minutes left, but I want to be mindful of the people in the room as well. So we have a few more questions that are coming through the Q&A chat forum, but want to see if anyone in the room had any questions for our panelists here. Yeah, let me hold on one second. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your discussion. I have a question. What do you think about the sort of pricing based on what the customers can pay. For example, we're in healthcare and we work with large healthcare companies that are, they can afford kind of a pretty high price, but we also get interest from startups and they can't pay the price comparable to the other guys. So what do you think of that? Because we were thinking of setting it differently, but then it's quite inconsistent and people in our industry do talk to each other. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's called pricing discrimination, and that's I know that we look at the word discrimination, and in most contexts that's bad, but in economic terms it's not bad at all. It's just having different pricing based off of different characteristics. And so if you have different types of customers, even within your own industry, who have the ability to pay at different rates, then you have to ask your question: is my cost to serve different? If I do have discriminatory pricing, is it something that I can easily explain to different folks that they look at and like, oh, that's logical, and those types of things? Most of the time, you can get away with that, as long as you do it and there's some sort of logic around how you're doing it. I think the big thing is just to make sure that one doesn't erode the other, as well as to make sure that you are making money, because it doesn't really matter how many widgets you sell. If it costs you $1 and you're selling it for 90 cents, it doesn't matter whether or not how many they buy or if they grow and those types of things. But I would say I wouldn't be super scared about it. Just have a specific logic that you can apply to it, as long as you can actually serve them in a profitable fashion. I sell to banks also and credit unions. And I'll tell you right now, there are banks and credit unions we will not sell, because there is a certain price that they have to pay to even cover just our fixed costs. And so we're just not going to work with them. But there's a big difference between a bank that has, 500 million under assets and 100 billion under assets. And so everybody expects them to pay different prices, and they understand that.
Yeah, agreed with that totally. Asset-based pricing is very, very common in financial services, so it's not abnormal to offer different prices based off of your customer.
Well, I know the other option that both Z Suite and Posh offer is basically just a different feature set, right? Whether it's just missing out on some of the premium items that obviously are going to cost more because it requires more implementation and more work to get up and running. So is there a trade-off where, the bare bones version of a product or a service is worth it? I guess, how do you establish that boundary level of the lowest tier priced option? I don't know, Nathan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think like even if you have like a low tier option, it still has to add value, right? So you can't like just to have like a freemium model or something where you want to make it easier for people to enter your ecosystem. If it's not a good product, like it doesn't really serve any purpose to do that. So you want to be mindful about, not necessarily stripping away value, but thinking about many dimensions of what makes this like a lower tier or starting point gateway, if you will, compared to like what your full suite is. Sometimes that can be like the cost to actually implement or the cost to actually stand up your product. Like you might have a lower tier offering that's cheaper for the customer, but it's also cheaper for you to actually build, maintain, implement, support, etc. You might also decide to do something where you have a feature set that you offer for some kind of gated time horizon, right? So you offer something for X amount of time. It gives the customer a chance to try it out. But at the end of the day, maybe it's not really economical for you to keep offering that at no cost or at a very low cost for a long time. So you give them the chance to try it out. You might get a little bit of a margin hit temporarily, but your confidence is that they see a lot of value, that at the end of X amount of time, they're like, hey, we really need this. We can't let go of this. We're going to be willing to pay for it. So there's like many ways you can do it, but that particular model is interesting where you believe with high confidence that people may not want to buy it initially because maybe they're skeptical of it initially, but once they actually experience it, they can't live without it, right? So that's an example of where you might either start with a low tier, or you might give the higher tier away at a lower price or for some amount of time because you trust that someone's going to upgrade over time as well.
Got it. The other thing, I don't necessarily, you may have come across as a consumer. I know Pam definitely has seen it from the banking side, from the enterprise, but this idea of kind of pricing theater, right? Where they say, okay, here's a subscription model. There's the upfront cost or fee for implementation or to set up. And then maybe there's an additional like customer service fee. But in order to really pull a customer in, we're going to waive your first couple months, right? We're going to do this or that, or we're going to do a very exponentially tiered pricing where your first year it's 30% of the actual baseline price, then it's going to go up to 70, then 90, then 100%. And so when you guys are thinking about your pricing model, especially for that initial traction, I mean, I won't lie, I fall for it all the time where I would say, oh, I get HBO Max 2 months free. I'm going to binge Game of Thrones. It's going to be great. And then you wind up paying $15 a month after the fact. They want you to forget. But when you think about, especially the initial traction, how much does that kind of pricing theater play into that so you can get a max capacity customer base to start? Pam, actually, I would love to hear your perspective because I know you've seen this before from multiple different types of companies.
Well, from my perspective, as one of the people that used to have to, write these write-ups on why we want to go with this company and what it's going to cost us, I think having the company having that built into their pricing of, hey, we're going to totally mark off this and it's, you just saved $50,000. It made it a lot easier to sell, to our executives of, oh, look, we just saved $20,000, $30,000 because they want us as a customer so bad. I think that made it a lot easier to sell internally. And I think from my experience, a lot of that was built in just for the fact that they could say, hey, we're going to save you $20,000 or $30,000 by waiving this fee. I think that was expected almost to negotiate that. So I think, if you build that in, that's something to take into consideration to build that into the pricing that you're going to offer is we're going to, in negotiation, we're going to cut this out just to say, hey, look, we saved you X amount. So, that's something to consider when setting that up. But I think that just being able to show, oh, look, they're so willing to work with us that, we can't afford this $20,000 even though we have billions of dollars to work with, helps just make it an easier sell for all parties, including the people internally trying to sell. Because as the company, you're not just trying to sell to the company that you're trying to sell to as a whole, but you're trying to sell to the individuals that are going to sign off on that. And I think just showing, hey, look, money saved already right up front makes that a little bit easier, especially when it's things for like implementation fees. Obviously that's going to cost the startup money to do the implementation, but I feel like many times it's been built into the pricing to have the expectation that that's going to get cut out, because I think at least 90% of the time that's been waived. Just, oh, look, we had a great conversation, we're going to either cut that in half or offer some kind of discount there and make that pricing seem better for you. And that, I think that just is a good show of, camaraderie of, look, we're going to work great together and this is going to, be a great relationship for you where you're going to save so much or make so much.
I would add, early on in my career, I would often take principled stances and be righteous on decision making. Like, for example, some of you in the room might be thinking, well, I believe that full transparency on my pricing and being consistent and fair in every single deal that I do is the most important thing for me. Therefore, I'm not going to do discounts. I'm always going to offer the best price up front. I'm not going to have to do this. I'm not going to have to do that. And, what I've learned is you can fight human nature if you want, but you ain't changing human nature. Whether it's a B2B company or a B2C company, I don't care who it is. Everybody likes a deal. Everybody likes a discount. Even if they know that you're doing it like on purpose, they still like it. So build it into your process. Take advantage of that. Not in a bad way, obviously. You're not taking advantage of anybody, but you're leveraging what you know about humans and taking a principled stand or being too righteous about those types of things in the end isn't going to be smart for your company. Now, I'd also say on the other hand, don't be stupid. Like if you throw out pricing and then you discount it by 75%, everyone's going to, that's like, come on, like way too transparent, people. You know, so you still want to be smart about it, but I would just encourage, if any of you in the audience are sitting there thinking, hey, I want to be, you know, I want to be super righteous and principled about this very particular thing, I'd say you could do that. And there are companies that have done that for sure. But you always have to ask the question, do I want to take the hard way or the easy way? If you're going to fight against human nature, that's the hard way. And it might be worth it as long as you understand why you're doing it. But definitely ask yourself the question before you do it.
Yeah, we had a question over here.
Nathan mentioning human nature got my question rolling. And that is, do you guys have information or thoughts on the psychology of a general consumer and whether or not, you know, when they're willing to buy into a subscription model, let's just say on an app, when are they willing to buy into that versus not? And how much are they willing to deal with advertisements on something if, you know, they're not going to pay?
Can I use the answer? It depends. I mean, it's super contextual in regards to what they're willing or not willing and what they're doing. I could tell you right now, to charge for access to the mobile banking app and putting ads on it, that would fall flat on its face. Whereas if you have a cool game that people want to play and you have ads on it, that's, you know, usually that's acceptable. So some of it is looking at what have other companies been able to get away with in that space, and what are the perceptions of that. And one of the nice things about consumer apps and those types of things, there's so many ratings and reviews and different things that you can actually get feedback very easily on. I mean, people write it if they hate the ads. They'll put it on the reviews, and you can actually just read them all. So your market research is pretty easy from that perspective. But in the end, like I don't know how to give advice to the question, because it's just so contextual based off of what you're actually doing. The one thing that I do know for sure, though, is once you set the expectation to a consumer that they don't need to pay for value, they will not be. It's going to be very hard to get them to pay for value later on. And so if you default in one area, try and default on charging for value first instead of just giving away for free, if you can, because I know that there's some spaces that you're not going to be able to get away with that.
Karan, Pam, anything you want to add there?
I can give my personal perspective. I think I'm way more willing to pay for like a premium version of an app if I feel like I support what the company is doing. So say it's just some, you know, some game that I don't really care about. I think I'm more willing to put up with the ads just to, you know, because it's going to be a temporary thing for me, right? It's not going to be something that I'm going to, you know, keep on my phone or on my laptop for 5-10 years. But if I think it's something that I'm like, hey, this is really important to me, and, you know, the cause behind it or the, you know, the founders behind it, I want to support them and I want to pay for, you know, the premium version of this, I'm way more likely to, you know, not do the trial version and get over the ads. Like Nathan said, you know, if you're offering you're offering something already and then you're saying, oh, now you need to pay for this value. Examples where I've experienced that, I'm like, okay, I'm going to immediately delete this because I've been doing it, you know, this way for 5 years, and now they're going to charge me for the same thing. I'm not going to use this anymore. Let me go find the competitor. So I think setting that expectation in the beginning and making sure you know where you want to go with that is super important. And then I think you're going to have customers that support your company and support the cause, even with games and things like that. But I think that's kind of the way that you should look at it.
And Karan, anything else you want to add?
No, I think they covered it.
Okay. So we're just about at time. I think the one question that I came through the chat a couple of times here is, Nathan, you mentioned a few books. I was wondering if the three panelists could just mention any other resources, books, forums, blogs, what have you, that could help early stage and even later stage founders understand their pricing model more, especially whether it's obviously you're all in financial services, but generally speaking, any industry, to get them more acquainted with how they should think about pricing and their revenue model.
Yeah, I'll say more than like books, I found just going out and talking to people is really valuable. Nathan mentioned having like an advisory board. I think like it's really important to understand the perspectives from the people that you're trying to sell to, and also what other companies are doing. Whether it's a consumer app or B2B, you want to let how the market is pricing or what people are accustomed to guide you, but not necessarily define you. And one really good way I think to like just kind of test the waters is really just to go talk to people, hypothetically get their advice. Like if you ask for advice, people are always willing to give it. They might not buy your product, but they're happy to give you advice on how you're pricing it, right? And that's really valuable.
I would agree with. I get people reaching out to me, via email, LinkedIn, etc. At events, asking, that very question of how should I do this, or what do you think about this, or how do you typically see this? And I think that's totally appropriate and acceptable. I think people are more than willing to give that information out. That's just the way of the industry is you just have to talk to people and get their insights, and mostly they're willing to share those. So don't be afraid to go and reach out to people.
And Nathan, you mentioned the 3 books. What were they again?
Yeah, Crossing the Chasm, Play Bigger, and then Blue Ocean Strategy. I don't remember if the guy from Blue Ocean Strategy, if he wrote a book, but it's one of the most popular Harvard Business Review articles that's ever been written. And those are all about marketing and category creation and differentiation out in the marketplace. I would say my favorite book when I'm looking at kind of a sales and kind of a sales funnel perspective, which all ties to pricing, is Demand Side Sales by Bob Moesta. He recently came out with another book too. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know if I can recommend it or not. But these are all very focused on marketing, on sales, on category creation, which are big drivers of what you can get away with from pricing perspective. Because the better you are at defining your category, the more value you're going to be able to capture in your pricing. As far as specific pricing strategies, I don't know if I have any particular books, but there's a whole bunch of stuff out there on general ideas of LTV to CAC ratios that you should be hitting and all that stuff.
And then, sorry, you had an author you liked?
Nathan mentioned one from Jeff Moore that I wanted to verify, which the book name, because I think I'd heard of that one before as well from another CEO, and it seems like a favorite amongst entrepreneurs.
It's Crossing the Chasm. I mean, if you went to business school, I would be shocked if you didn't have to read that book. It is it's a fantastic book. It's really, really good. It's tied specifically to like software and technology. You guys have probably heard of the product adoption lifecycle curve of like early adopters, innovators, late adopters, all that type of stuff. It came from that book.
Yeah, funny enough, I have 2 copies of that book. So if anyone wants to borrow it, feel free. Well, that does it for the panel on pricing. I just want to thank Nisarg and the panelists here for taking the time, especially Pam was out in California, so it's really early for her. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Yep.
Excellent. So we have a quick kind of 15-minute break here. In this room, in about 15 minutes, we were going to be speaking about mentors and advisors, how to find one when you need one, and how to foster that relationship. And then over at the WPI building, which is at 303